As 2022 winds down, let's reflect on the stories of South Asia, the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of countries and the people. Our top focus on the show today is how the economies in South Asia fared this year. Remember, the world barely recovered from the worst of the COVID pandemic this year, a once-in-a-century event that left most economies battered, and while some countries bounced back, for most the economic challenges remain grave. 2022 was a year when India overtook the United Kingdom as the fifth largest economy in the world and also emerged as the world's fastest growing major economy. However, for India's neighbors in South Asia, it's been a dramatically opposite story, with their economies collapsing and facing unprecedented crises or struggling to stay afloat. Here's a report.
"2022 has been a dynamic year for South Asia. Just coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, countries were faced with myriad challenges. Some glided through the crisis, some barely managed to swim through, while others sank. A few weeks ago, the World Bank issued a statement on South Asian economies. It said growth in the region is slowing down, and the reasons are Sri Lanka's economic collapse, the deadly Pakistan floods, a global economic slowdown, and the lingering scars of the pandemic. The outlook sounds grim, but one nation sitting at the center of the region was able to manage the economic situation with relative ease. We're talking about India. It is set to become the fastest growing economy in 2023 as post-pandemic retail booms and recent balance sheet repairs bring in new investments. Talking about post-pandemic growth, India's export and service sector staged a stronger recovery than the world average, while its ample foreign reserves served as a buffer to external shocks. According to a recent survey carried out by the Indian Central Bank, the South Asian power's economy is expected to grow at 6% in the next fiscal year. While the 6% figure is lower than the current 6.8% projected growth, the outlook is in sharp contrast to the global projections. The war in Ukraine has impacted the West hard. Inflation in the United States and European countries has gone through the roof, prompting a dive in their fiscal figures. While talking about South Asian economies, Sri Lanka is a name that cannot be missed. In 2022, the island nation saw the worst financial crisis in its history, a watershed moment for the country. When over a decade of financial mismanagement added up to Colombo's economy grinding to a halt. The factors that triggered the collapse were unchecked external borrowings, tax cuts that increased the budget deficit, and restrictions on the import of chemical fertilizers. The COVID-19 pandemic was the final nail in the coffin. For the first time in its independent history, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt in the month of May. Its usable foreign reserves were left at a mere $25 million. Its currency fell by 80%, and food inflation figures stood at a record 90% high. The fiscal crisis triggered a never-seen-before uprising in the country. That cost the Rajapaksas their government. Commentators seized on Sri Lanka's economic collapse as a cautionary tale. It was an illustration of the dangers of over-dependence on Chinese loans. The disproportionate effects far-off conflicts can have on poor countries and the costs of years of economic misgovernance. Elsewhere in South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal and Pakistan each faced similar economic woes this year, but none as severe as Sri Lanka's. Let's now look at India's next-door neighbour, Pakistan. With foreign reserves rapidly plunging and no relief in near sight, the Pakistan economy is staring at impending doom. For months, its currency has been floating over the 200 mark against the dollar. There's a high-risk premium in international financial markets, a high debt burden, and the recent shock of the devastating floods, adding to Islamabad's tragic tale of an economic downturn. As challenges kept piling up on the economic front, the country's foreign exchange reserves have dipped below $7 billion. And the fear of bankruptcy is rapidly growing. The country is in dire need of foreign aid to reduce its current account deficit and to ensure enough reserves to pay its debt obligations for the next financial year. The situation was bad to start with, but became drastically worse after Pakistan witnessed catastrophic flooding. With losses pegged at over $15 billion, millions of crops were damaged or destroyed, heightening food insecurity. The war in Ukraine and the consequent global crude oil crisis hit Bangladesh hard. Poor export demand, high inflation, falling remittances, depleting forex reserves, and an energy crisis swiftly eroded the economy's fundamentals, taking it on a downward spiral, stirring political unrest, civilian frustration, and deepening problems for the country's sizable poor population.